Hey there API developers, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to show you how to take your Springboot API and transform it into an OpenAPI specification using the wonderful Springdoc OpenAPI library. As a bonus, I'll also show you how you can then take that OpenAPI specification and transform it into a client library for Java and many other major programming languages. So let's get into it. First, I'll start with the basic Spring Boot MVC application and then add the Springdoc OpenAPI dependency to my pommel.xml file. This library will automatically generate an OpenAPI specification and make it available on my server at the /v3/API-docs endpoint. But first, I'll annotate the application with some OpenAPI specific attributes. I'll do this because while the Springdoc OpenAPI library can automatically derive many details about a Spring Boot API, it still needs additional information to produce a robust OpenAPI specification. I'll first create a high-level configuration class for the OpenAPI specification. This includes basic info about the name of the API, its version, and a short description. Now, let's start annotating the endpoints. This project is simple and only has a single /greeting endpoint. Real-world projects will of course be more complex, but remember that you don't need to annotate your entire project at once. You can even use AI to great effect to fill out a lot of this. But keep in mind that you can take your time, annotate your project in sections, and try using your generated OpenAPI specifications as you go along. Ultimately, you'll document your project once and then it's good forever. First, I'll edit the data transfer object that represents a greeting, and add schema annotations that contain descriptions, examples, and requirements about the object. And lastly, I'll edit the greeting controller for the /greeting endpoint and add the operation annotation to describe what the endpoint does and what its possible responses are. Some of these annotations are intended to be human readable, like descriptions, and others are intended to be used by tooling, like the content definition. And that's all there is to setting up a project to generate an OpenAPI spec. There's plenty of other useful annotations that I haven't covered here, but I'll add some reference links down below to the full set of annotation options available to you. Now, let's try using our OpenAPI specification. By default, it will be exposed, as I mentioned, at the /v3/API-docs endpoint. I'll start the Spring Boot application in a new terminal and detach it. Now that my server is running and producing an OpenAPI spec, I can use it to do things like validate my API, produce documentation, or automatically generate SDKs. Let's try generating SDKs with a tool called Liblab. I'll make a new project directory and initialize it by running liblab init and passing in the URL to my OpenAPI spec. I'll select Java, but you have the option to build SDKs for many other languages. And then I'll name my project. Let's call it Spring Boot, and I'll select the GPL license. I'll get prompted to build my project, but I'll say no, since I first need to set the base URL, which I'll point to my local Spring Boot server. Now to build, I'll just run liblab build. The build process will validate the OpenAPI spec and then start building the SDKs. The whole process takes about 15 seconds. And done. The project is now built. Let's look at the output directory where we can see the generated client library. This Java library is fully built and ready for me to deploy to any Java repository. But for the time being, I'll just navigate to the examples directory and use it locally. Here, you can see the code that we're going to run. It was automatically generated and simply makes a request to the /greeting endpoint. I already started the server earlier, so now I'll run the run.sh script, which will run a few Maven commands to set up the project and then make the request. And there we go. We've got the response we expected, and every user of this library will have type completion and documentation as well, thanks to the Liblab SDK. And that's really all there is to it. The Spring Boot OpenAPI library makes it incredibly simple to generate an OpenAPI spec from your Spring Boot project, and you can then take that spec and use it in a whole bunch of tooling like Liblab to benefit your users and your own API development. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out the links down below. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.